Today on the Daily Dose, Seneca Village. In 1825, after John and Elizabeth Whitehead subdivided their land into 200 lots for sale, predominantly African-American buyers established Seneca Village, far removed from the filth, crime, and bustle of greater New York City. As the community grew over its 32-year existence, by the mid-1850s, Seneca Village was made up of 50 homes, 3 churches, a cemetery, and a school for African-American students. By 1855, the village boasted over 225 residents, roughly 2/3 African-American, 1/3 Irish, and a handful of Germans. And while slavery in the state of New York was outlawed in 1827, Seneca Village allowed African Americans to live in an autonomous community, far removed from the still prevalent racial discrimination harbored by the majority of white New Yorkers. During a time when immigrants lived in densely packed tenement squalor, many residents in Seneca Village lived in large 2-story homes, while records indicate that most villagers were employed in some of the top jobs then available to African Americans, while still other records indicate that most Seneca Village children attended school. Black residents at Seneca Village proved to be more stable and prosperous than many other blacks living in Manhattan, many owning property worth $250 or more, which, along with a history of 3 years of stable residency, earned them the right to vote. By 1845, of the 100 black New Yorkers eligible to vote, 10 lived in Seneca Village. During the early 1850s, however, city planners had their eye on the creation of a 775-acre park in central Manhattan, from 59th Street to 106th, and when the plan was enacted into law in 1853, creating the nation's first major public park, the city acquired Seneca Village and the surrounding parklands by eminent domain, which allows local governments to seize private land for public use, effectively displacing 1,600 inhabitants for the creation of Central Park. By 1857, all residents of Seneca Village had been displaced to new locations within the New York City metro area, including many to Sandy Ground in Staten Island or Skunk Hollow in New Jersey, making Seneca Village a bygone oasis in one of the busiest cities on earth. Today in the Daily Dose, Selma's Bloody Sunday. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, nearly a century after the abolition of slavery in America, civil rights activists focused their attention on Dallas County, Alabama, where more than half the population was black, yet less than 2% of black residents were registered to vote. On Sunday, March 7th, activist John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Uzziah Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Council led some 600 protesters from the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma on a planned 54-mile march to Alabama's capital city of Montgomery, in an attempt to meet directly with Alabama Governor George Wallace in a high-profile appeal for African-American voting rights. Walking through Selma unimpeded, when the protesters reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate general and reputed Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan, the marchers were stopped by a wall of state police, wearing riot gear and gas masks, as they slapped their billy clubs against their hands in open anticipation, while spectators waved Confederate flags, with an equal sense of impending violence. It would be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, Major John Cloud called out through a bullhorn. This is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse. Go home or go to your church. Instead, when the marchers failed to turn around, the troopers advanced like a phalanx of hate, brutally assaulting the protesters with clubs, bullwhips, and rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire, all in front of news cameras who captured the violence amid an uproar of cheers from reveling white bystanders. Although ultimately forced back, in the spirit of nonviolent protest advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi before him, the marchers refused to fight back. Hours later, when ABC News anchor Frank Reynolds interrupted the network's star-studded premiere of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, nearly 50 million Americans witnessed the brutal savagery of what would become known as Bloody Sunday. Outrage swept the slowly awakening nation, leading to sit-ins and demonstrations of white solidarity, making Selma's Bloody Sunday a turning point moment in a nation's slow embrace of equal rights. Today on the Daily Dose, Ruby Bridges. Born during the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, just 3 months and 21 days after the Supreme Court's 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education, at the age of 5, Ruby Bridges attended a segregated kindergarten until significant federal pressure forced the Orleans Parish School District to admit black children into all-white segregated schools. In early 1960, Bridges was one of 6 black children in New Orleans who passed a test to determine whether they could attend the all-white William Frantz Elementary School, a test primarily designed to slow and impede desegregation efforts. 2 stayed at their old school, 3 transferred to another all-white school, while Ruby Bridges alone attended William Frantz Elementary. On November 14, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby and her mother Lucille approached Frantz Elementary despite a throng of angry white protesters who threw objects and shouted angry racist epitaphs. Escorted into school by 4 federal marshals, years later, Charles Burks, one of the marshals in attendance, recalled that Ruby showed a lot of courage. She never cried, she didn't whimper, she just marched along like a little soldier, and we're all so very proud of her. White parents quickly began pulling their children out of classrooms, obliging Barbara Henry, a teacher from Boston, Massachusetts, to teach Bridges for an entire year on a one-on-one basis. A day later, Methodist minister Lloyd Anderson Foreman was the first white parent to escort his 5-year-old daughter past the angry mob, until one by one, white students returned to Frantz Elementary to resume their studies. During the early days of desegregation in New Orleans schools, as Bridges walked to school each morning, one white woman repeatedly threatened to poison her, while another held up a black baby doll in a coffin, until even the worst racist haters began to accept the inevitability of the federal government's desegregation mandates. Today, Ruby Bridges has published 4 books on her youthful story and the ongoing need for racial tolerance and acceptance, at the same time receiving many honorable degrees and awards along the way. Now chair of the Ruby Bridges Foundation, the group's mission is to promote the values of tolerance, respect, and appreciation of all differences. Racism is a grown-up disease, Bridges maintains, and we must stop using our children to spread it, making Ruby Bridges one of the leading voices in America's slow embrace of racial equality. And there you have it, Ruby Bridges, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Madam C.J. Walker. Born Sarah Breedlove on Christmas Eve, 1867, the future Madam C.J. Walker grew up on a sharecropping plantation in Louisiana, moving in with her older sister Lavinia when she was orphaned at age 7. Working cotton fields with her sister, at age 14, Walker married Moses McWilliams, mainly to get away from her abusive brother-in-law. And when McWilliams passed away in 1887, Walker became a single mom for her 2-year-old daughter. In an attempt to escape crushing poverty, in 1889, Walker moved to St. Louis, where 4 of her older brothers ran a barbershop. joining the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she grew inspired by the leading black men and women of the city. Struggling with alopecia or hair loss, ongoing financial difficulties, and health issues relating from her years of hard labor, in 1904, Walker's life took a turn for the better when she joined African-American entrepreneur Annie Turbo Malone's burgeoning hair loss business. Moving to Denver as a saleswoman for the company, Walker married ad man Charles Joseph Walker, renaming herself Madam C.J. Walker before launching her own line of hair products and straighteners with a mere $1.25 investment. Advocating for economic independence for black women, Walker's business took off like wildfire, and after her divorce, Walker built a factory in Indianapolis, at the same time opening a training program for black female saleswomen known as the Walker System, eventually employing 40,000 women in the U.S., Central America, and the Caribbean, making C.J. Walker the first black female millionaire in American history. Founding the National Negro Cosmetics Manufacturers Association in 1917, by the time of her death 2 years later, Walker's cosmetic business had grown in sales to $500,000 annually, or $8.6 million in today's currency, leaving behind an estate worth $1 million, including a mansion in Irvington, New York named Villa Luaro, along with properties in Harlem, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. In her later years, Walker became an avid philanthropist, sending 6 African-American students to the Tuskegee Institute, while donating significant funds to the efforts of the NAACP. Shortly before her death to kidney failure at age 51, Walker redrafted her will to bequeath 2/3 of her company's future net profits to charity and African-American educational institutions, making Madam C.J. Walker a stunning success during a time of racial bias in America. And there you have it, Madam C.J. Walker, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Juneteenth. The divide over slavery in America goes back decades before the Civil War, prompting Abraham Lincoln to declare in a landmark 1854 speech that if the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. After hostilities broke out between the North and the South on April 12, 1861, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1862, which allowed black men to serve in the U.S. Army, followed by the Confiscation Act, which stated that all slaves seized from Confederate supporters were immediately made free. After President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring that all enslaved people were thenceforward and forever free, Lincoln understood that his decree applied only to territories not currently part of the Union states. But his proclamation's symbolic stand shifted the North's Civil War objectives from not only the preservation of the Union, but for the abolition of slavery from American soil. In Texas, a state largely ignored during the Civil War, many slave owners had moved into the state as a safe haven from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, until on June 19, 1865, when Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived at Galveston to declare that after 246 years of involuntary servitude in the United States, all enslaved men, women, and children were now free from bondage. In 1866, the 250,000 freed blacks in Texas organized the first Jubilee Day on June 19th, which over the coming decades would spread across the country as African Americans migrated out of Texas to other parts of the United States. Juneteenth celebrations grew year after year with a wide variety of festivities, including parades, barbecues, prayer services, and live music. In 1979, Texas became the first state to declare Juneteenth an official state holiday, while on June 17th of 2021, President Joe Biden made Juneteenth a national holiday, the first in over 38 years, after Martin Luther King Jr. Day was signed into law on November 2, 1983, by then-President Ronald Reagan. Today in the Daily Dose, Jim Crow laws in the segregated South. Named after a black minstrel show character, Jim Crow laws were a collection of mostly Southern state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation, which were implemented shortly after the end of the Civil War and lasted until the civil rights protests and federal legislation of the 1960s. The laws were intended to marginalize African Americans by suppressing their right to vote, limiting their access to good-paying jobs, while excluding access to higher education. Those who attempted to shirk the laws often faced arrest, fines, jail time, violence, and even death. In 1896, the first legal attempt to repeal Jim Crow laws was upheld in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal doctrine, affirming racial segregation in public facilities, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were routinely inferior and underfunded compared to facilities maintained exclusively for whites. While the laws as a whole institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans living in the South, segregation was also adhered to in the U.S. military, while in 1913, Southern Democratic President Woodrow Wilson initiated national segregation policies in federal workplaces. Southern statutes continued to impose poll taxes on Black Americans, attempting to suppress them from voting in local, state, and national elections. In 1954, segregation of state-funded public schools was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education. Yet most Southern states dragged their feet for years before integration was finally achieved, against great backlash from white Southerners. In 1964, the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow laws in other cases such as Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. v. United States. The last vestiges of Jim Crow laws came to an end when they were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, bringing to an end white America's long and stained history of racial suppression against Black Americans. Today in the Daily Dose, Brown v. Board of Education. After the Supreme Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, affirming that racially segregated public facilities were legal, provided facilities for blacks and whites were equal, the ruling cemented Jim Crow laws, particularly in the southern states, that would stand for the next 6 decades to come. By the early 1950s, however, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, began challenging steadfast segregation laws, filing lawsuits in states like South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, including a 1951 class action suit against the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education after Oliver Brown's daughter, Linda, was denied entrance into Topeka's all-white elementary schools. Citing the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, Brown's suit maintained that black schools were inferior to white schools, and while the U.S. District Court in Kansas agreed with Brown's claim, the court continued to uphold the separate but equal clause from Plessy v. Ferguson. Reaching the Supreme Court in 1952, Brown's case was combined with 4 other similar challenges under the name Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, with NAACP's Thurgood Marshall serving as chief attorney for the plaintiffs. And while the Supreme Court justices were initially divided on a ruling, Chief Justice Fred M. Vinson firmly believing that the Plessy verdict should stand, After Vinson's death in September of 1953, new Chief Justice Earl Warren engineered a unanimous verdict against school segregation on May 17, 1954, ruling that segregated schools were inherently unequal. Known as Brown v. Board of Education II, in May of 1955, the Supreme Court issued a second opinion that remanded all future desegregation cases to the lower federal court system, an opinion that opened the door for local judicial and political evasion of desegregation laws and court opinions. The issue of desegregation would come to a head in 1957 Little Rock, Arkansas, when Governor Orville Faubus called in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent black students from attending Little Rock Central High School, obliging President Dwight D. Eisenhower to deploy federal troops to ensure that 9 black students were successfully integrated into the school. Continued white resistance to desegregation, however, did much to fuel the nascent civil rights movement in America, eventually leading to the eradication of Jim Crow laws in the South, making Brown v. Board of Education a landmark ruling in a nation's slow embrace of racial equality. And there you have it, Brown v. Board of Education, today on the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share the link with a friend or colleague so that they too can learn something new every day.